FPV versus camera drones, those are two very broad topics. So I'm going to be a bit more specific about what I'm referring to as a camera drone or an FPV drone. So when I'm talking about camera drones, I'm referring to consumer drones like the DJI Mini, Air, and Mavic series. These are what I'm familiar with, and as far as camera drones, they probably have some of the most refined technology. These drones are flown line of sight or using a screen on the controller to display the camera view. They are GPS stabilized and they have cameras on gimbals and are capable of capturing professional quality photographs and videos. Now, the FPV drones or quads I'm referring to are what are known as Cinewhoops and freestyle quads. Now, the Avata is a Cinewhoop, but I don't include it in this category for reasons I'll explain later. But these are flown first-person view through a camera on the front of the drone using a set of goggles. They have fixed cameras on the front, but often include mounts for an action camera. And it used to be that these drones were built from scratch, but now there are a wide variety of pre-built or bind-and-fly quads out there. However, all of these FPV quads do require some degree of programming using software like Betaflight to make the thing work. Hey everyone, it's Mark with Create and Kaptivate. I'm back, and today I'm going to be talking about FPV versus camera drones. Now, I will be talking about some of the main differences between the two, but also when and why I use one over the other. Obviously, I have both types and I use them both a fair bit, but lately I've been using one a lot more than the other, and it's not the one I started out with. So the first thing I want to talk about is the barrier to entry, because this is probably the biggest factor that will determine where most people start out in the hobby. And for this reason, most people, like myself, end up entering the hobby through consumer camera drones, mainly because the barrier to entry is low. Basically, you can buy the drone in a combo and it comes with everything you need to fly it. And the only setup you might have to do is buy the equipment and update firmware. Other than that, it's ready to fly. And when it comes to flying these drones, they take off, land, and hover all by themselves, and the flight controller does most of the flying. For the most part, you're just telling it what direction to go. Now, although the barrier to entry is low for these type of drones, there is still a ton of settings and features to learn, and some really impressive things you can do. And I'll talk about some of that later in this video. But now I want to talk a little bit about FPV, where the barrier to entry is much higher, although not as high as it used to be when your only choice was to build your own quad and set it up from scratch. Now there are a bunch of bind and fly options out there that get you most of the way to having a drone you can fly. You will still need to bind your equipment and set it up in something like Betaflight, which isn't that hard, but it's something you have to learn. Now that gets you a drone that is ready to fly, but there is no easy way around learning to fly. These things are flown manually, where you're in full control of the pitch, roll, yaw, and throttle, and you need to continually maintain all four of these to keep the quad in the air. These quads don't just hover in place like a GPS stabilized camera drone. If you stop flying it, it will crash. And that's probably one of the reasons why a lot of people don't start out with FPV. FPV is also a lot less mainstream than your typical camera drones, like DJI, where you can just pick one up at Best Buy or order one from Amazon. FPV quads and accessories are typically purchased from hobby shops that tailor to the FPV hobby. Now, there are DJI variations of FPV drones, like the Avata, which I think has helped bring a lot of people into the hobby, much like myself. They do have features that make it easier to learn how to fly in manual and offer a sort of stepping stone into FPV. But I wouldn't put them in the same category as the FPV quads I'm referring to, mainly because they are proprietary equipment and you must use their batteries, their controllers, and their goggles. You can't program them, nor can you really work on them or interchange parts, and another reason I'll get to shortly. But first, I want to talk about the purpose I'm using these two types of drones for. And of course, this isn't going to be the same for every person, but mainly I just fly FPV because it's fun. Most of the time, I'm not really worried about the footage I'm capturing. I'm just out flying around. And it's probably the closest thing you can get to flying without actually leaving the ground. You're wearing these goggles that totally immerses you into that flying experience, and these things are high performance. You can climb 100 feet in seconds, dive straight down, do all sorts of flips, rolls, and spins. you're basically in full control of this aircraft and you have a front row seat to the view. Now, on the other hand, I'm not really going out to fly my camera drones just for fun. I use these drones for aerial photography and capturing cinematic video, and they have a ton of features like intelligent flight modes, gimbal stabilized cameras, and full manual camera settings that enable you to capture professional quality photos and videos. And for that purpose, at least for me, a camera drone is the best tool. Like I said earlier, these drones can do most of the flying for you, especially if you're using any of the hyperlapse, waypoint, or active track features. And this allows you to pay attention to things like camera settings and shot composition while you're flying. And with camera drones like the various DJI models, you can become proficient enough to capture quality videos and photos in a short amount of time. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of room for progression, because there is. These camera drones have loads of settings and features that certainly take time to become familiar with and learn how to use them in different scenarios. The one thing I did find eventually was it became increasingly difficult to find new places to fly from. I was trying to find places with cool sceneries or subjects to capture, and often spent a lot of time just looking for locations to fly instead of actually flying. And that's when I started getting into FPV a bit more. I already had the Avata. In fact, I had both, so I could go out with either of these and just rip around for fun. But I wasn't flying them in manual, so what I could do with them was still quite limited. I could do these sort of pretend dives, but I certainly couldn't do flips or rolls, and my top speed was significantly reduced. So I decided to learn how to fly in manual mode, and that's a whole different story. I might actually make a video on that. But once I learned to fly around comfortably, that's when I started to see the potential of what you could actually do with these things. It also wasn't long before I realized my Avatas didn't have the same performance as something like this. This is a bind and fly 5-inch freestyle quad, and performance-wise, it's just on a different level than the Avata. It's kind of like driving a bus compared to a sports car. So now, instead of spending my time trying to find locations to fly at, I was just going out to fly for fun. And really, an open field was all I needed. When you're just learning, you don't want a lot of obstacles around, and it certainly takes a lot of practice. Even after a few months, I could fly around no problem, but trying to do any tricks was pretty sketchy. Now, something else I discovered a short time later was drones like these are nearly as capable as the bigger drones, but can be flown in a lot more places. This one is a 3-inch freestyle quad, and this one is a 2-inch Cinewhoop, and both of these with a battery are well under 250 grams. They also don't attract a lot of attention because they're fairly quiet, and they basically look like toys. But they're great to learn with because they're a whole lot of fun, and because of their size and weight, they're a lot less likely to get damaged if you crash them. And that's one thing with FPV. Crashing is a lot more likely. For one, you're flying these things in manual and often in close proximity to objects or the ground. And for that reason, FPV drones, including the Avata, are built to take a crash. They can often take a pretty hard crash and have little to no damage. And if you do break them, you can at least buy parts and repair them, unlike consumer drones, which includes the Avata. Now, that's a lot different than flying a camera drone because the consequence of crashing is often a broken drone. And unless it's just a broken prop, you likely won't be able to repair it and you'll have to send it away. Now, the thing with camera drones is you're not typically flying in a manner that will cause you to crash other than running into obstacles. And that's why they have features like obstacle avoidance to help you not crash. Not something you can solely rely on, but it provides some assistance. Now, another difference that is very prominent between the two types of drones is battery life. You can often get 30+ minutes with a camera drone, and you're looking at somewhere around 5 minutes with an FPV drone, depending on how you fly. But you're basically trading performance for battery life. And that has a lot to do with the type of batteries these two types of drones use. Typically, you run FPV quads on LiPo or lithium polymer batteries, which is a big contributor to the performance, whereas camera drones run on lithium-ion batteries, which gives you longer flight times. And when it comes to the batteries for FPV quads, there's a bit more to understand. You don't just get a bunch of batteries and a charger like you do when you buy the camera drone combo. FPV batteries come in all different sizes and cell counts, and there's a bit more to understand when it comes to charging and storing them. Now, the one thing I do find when flying FPV, especially when I'm just flying for fun, is the battery life you get is usually sufficient. You have to be totally focused on flying the whole time the drone is in the air, so after a few minutes, I'm ready to take a break and change batteries. On the other hand, the longer battery life you get with camera drones is almost necessary, especially for things like hyperlapses. But even when you're trying to capture photos or videos, it gives you time to get to a location, adjust your settings, and then capture the subject or scenery and possibly repeat that process. And that's one thing I always try and get a variety of shots using different movements and settings. And for that, having a GPS stabilized drone with intelligent flight modes and a wide range of camera settings is the ideal choice. Except maybe if it's high-speed action shots you're after. This is something an FPV quad might be a better choice. Just the sheer performance of the quad and the control you have over its movements allows you to track subjects at high speed and just capture very dynamic shots. And ultimately, when it comes to FPV, I didn't realize just how much selection there is. You could essentially buy or build an FPV quad suited for any purpose, whether it's freestyle, long range, cinematography, or even something small enough you can fly in your house. And that brings me to the Tiny Whoop. This is a 65mm Tiny Whoop, and with a battery it weighs just 25 grams. It may be small, but it flies very well. And with a little practice, I was able to fly it around my house no problem. No need to pack up my stuff and go somewhere to fly. I can literally sit in my room where I have all my gear and fly from there. But the biggest benefit to me is I can fly regardless of the weather outside. Because where I live, and I'm sure a lot of people that fly drones are in the same situation, for several months of the year, there's snow on the ground and it's often too cold to fly outside. But with a Tiny Whoop, I can fly inside all year round, day or night, and the weather outside doesn't matter. And that's about all I have for this video. I really wanted to highlight some of the differences between FPV and camera drones, but more importantly, I wanted to talk about the purposes I use each of them for. So maybe other people can see that they might have a use for one or the other. But I also feel that there may be a lot of people like myself that started out with camera drones and really didn't know much about FPV and just how much fun it can be. So hopefully this video has given you some information you may not have known or sparked some interest you didn't have before. Anyways, thanks for watching and I'll see you on the next one.